My daughter handed me the most beautiful gift I'd ever received, an all-expenses-paid Northern Lights trip to Alaska. But when I came home early from my pre-trip doctor's appointment, I overheard her on the phone saying, "The guide will make it look like an accident. She slipped on the ice, fell, froze to death." I smiled and quietly set down my purse, thinking, "Well, sweetheart, let's see who survives this little game of yours. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button." My name is Eleanor Morrison, and at 68 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of life's surprises. I was wrong. Standing in my own hallway, listening to my only child plot my murder, I realized that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones planning your funeral. Let me tell you how I got here, because this story didn't start with Catherine's phone call. It started 3 weeks ago when she showed up at my Boston brownstone with tears in her eyes and what I thought was the most generous gift any daughter could give her aging mother. "Mom, you've been so sad since Dad died," she'd said, wrapping her arms around me in the living room where I'd raised her. "I know how much you miss him, how lonely you've been. Marcus and I want to do something special for you." Marcus Blake, her husband of 20 years, stood behind her, nodding with that practiced sincerity he'd perfected as a corporate lawyer. Their 2 children, Sophie and Ryan, flanked them like a picture-perfect family unit. "We've booked you the Northern Lights adventure you always talked about," Catherine continued, producing a glossy brochure. "Remember how you and Dad used to say you'd go to Alaska someday? Well, now you can. Everything's paid for. Flights, hotel, guided tours, the works." I'd been speechless. The trip cost more than my entire year's grocery budget. But looking at their hopeful faces, especially my grandchildren's excitement, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with gratitude. 7 days and 6 nights in Fairbanks, Marcus added. The guide is supposed to be the best in the business, Thomas Mackenzie, 20 years of experience. What I didn't know then was that Thomas Mackenzie had gambling debts that made him willing to do things that had nothing to do with Aurora viewing. But standing in my hallway today, 3 weeks later, listening to Catherine discuss the details of my accident with someone on the phone, I finally understood. The gift wasn't generosity. It was a death sentence wrapped in a bow. "The insurance money will cover everything," she was saying, her voice carrying from the kitchen where she thought she had privacy. $2 million from the life insurance, plus we can sell the house immediately. Marcus says the market's perfect. $2 million. That's what my life was worth to my daughter. I remained frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. Catherine didn't know I'd returned early from Dr. Peterson's office. She thought I was still sitting in a waiting room, discussing my blood pressure medication. Instead, I was listening to her plan my death with the clinical precision of someone discussing a business transaction. "Mom's always been clumsy," she continued. "Everyone knows that. She fell down those stairs last year. Remember? And she's been so scattered since Dad died. It'll be completely believable." My late husband Robert would have been horrified. He'd adored Catherine, defended her through every rebellious phase, every poor decision. But Robert had been gone for 2 years, and apparently that was long enough for our daughter to transform into someone I didn't recognize. The phone call ended, and I heard her footsteps approaching. I quickly slipped out the front door, closing it as quietly as possible, then made a show of returning with my keys jingling. "Mom, is that you?" Catherine called from the kitchen. "Just getting back from the doctor," I called out cheerfully. Traffic was terrible. She appeared in the doorway, smiling that same loving smile she'd worn since childhood. Looking at her now, I marveled at how perfectly she concealed her true intentions. If I hadn't heard that phone call, I would have continued believing in her devotion right up until I froze to death on an Alaskan mountainside. "How did the appointment go?" she asked, with what sounded like genuine concern. "Oh, you know Dr. Peterson. He worries about everything, but I'm healthy as a horse." Her smile flickered for just a moment. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm so glad you're taking care of yourself." As she busied herself making tea, I studied her profile. When had my sweet Catherine become capable of murder? When had her financial problems become more important than her mother's life? The answer came to me as I watched her careful movements. This wasn't sudden desperation. This was calculated planning. She'd been thinking about this for a while, waiting for the right opportunity. "The Alaska trip is in 5 days," she said, handing me a steaming mug. "Are you excited?" I smiled back, matching her false warmth with my own. "I can hardly wait." But what Catherine didn't know was that her father had taught me more than she realized during our 40-year marriage. Robert Morrison wasn't just any lawyer. He was a criminal defense attorney who'd shared stories about every type of case imaginable. I knew exactly how murder investigations worked, how evidence was gathered, and most importantly, how guilty people behaved. Catherine was about to discover that underestimating a retired literature teacher was a fatal mistake. And I do mean fatal. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt since Robert's funeral. My daughter wanted me dead, and I was going to give her exactly what she wanted, with a twist she'd never see coming. I spent 3 hours at the Boston Public Library researching everything I could about Alaska wilderness deaths. Hypothermia statistics, search and rescue protocols, insurance claim procedures. The more I read, the more I understood Catherine's plan. Alaska was perfect for what she had in mind, but two could play this game. By noon, I was sitting across from James Patterson, Robert's former law partner, and the only person I trusted with what I'd discovered. At 73, James still practiced law with the sharp mind that had made him legendary in Boston's legal circles. "Eleanor, what you're describing is attempted murder," he said, leaning back in his leather chair after I'd told him about the phone call. "We need to contact the police immediately." "With what proof?" I asked. "My word against hers? She'll deny everything, claim I misunderstood, maybe even suggest I'm having memory issues. You know how these things go, James." He nodded grimly. We both knew how family disputes played out in court, especially when one party was elderly and recently widowed. The system would protect Catherine, not me. "So what do you propose?" "I'm going to Alaska as planned," I said, "but Thomas Mackenzie is going to get a surprise he's not expecting." James raised an eyebrow. "What kind of surprise?" "The kind where his gambling debts get paid off by someone other than my daughter. The kind where he suddenly remembers he has a conscience. You see, I'd learned something interesting during my library research. Thomas Mackenzie owed $47,000 to some very unpleasant people in Las Vegas. Catherine had discovered this and was using it to blackmail him into cooperation. But what she didn't know was that Eleanor Morrison had her own resources. Robert's life insurance had left me well off, though I'd never told Catherine the exact amount. She assumed I was struggling financially because I lived modestly and occasionally mentioned being careful with money. In reality, I was sitting on nearly $500,000, plus the house that was worth another $600,000. "You're planning to bribe him?" James asked. "I'm planning to offer him a better deal. $50,000 to help me fake my own death versus complicity in actual murder for whatever Catherine's paying him." James was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, what you're suggesting is incredibly dangerous. If something goes wrong, I'll actually die, and Catherine will get what she wants anyway. But if I do nothing, I'm definitely going to die. At least this way, I have a chance." The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I would die in Alaska, exactly as Catherine expected. But instead of actually freezing to death, I would disappear into a new identity I was already working on establishing. Meanwhile, Catherine would reveal her true nature by celebrating her windfall, giving me all the evidence I needed to destroy her. "What about the children?" James asked gently. "Sophie and Ryan?" The mention of my grandchildren hit harder than anything else. Sophie was 16, Ryan 13. They loved their grandmother, but they also loved their parents. This situation would devastate them. "They'll be better off knowing the truth about their mother than living with a murderer," I said, though saying it aloud made my heart break a little. James spent the next hour trying to talk me out of the plan. He suggested private investigators, wire recordings, even confronting Catherine directly. But I'd made up my mind. Catherine had shown me who she really was. Now I was going to show her what happens when you underestimate someone who's lived longer, learned more, and has nothing left to lose. That evening, I called Catherine to confirm the trip details. "I'm so excited, sweetheart," I told her. "I've been reading about the Northern Lights. Did you know the best viewing is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? That's wonderful, Mom. Thomas will take you to all the best spots." "I'm sure he will. You picked such a thoughtful gift." After I hung up, I sat in Robert's old study, surrounded by his law books and case files. Somewhere in this room was the inspiration for what I was about to do. Robert had once defended a woman who'd faked her own death to escape an abusive husband. The case had fascinated him because of its complex legal implications. The woman had been caught eventually, but only because she'd made contact with family members too soon. She'd gotten sentimental, reached out to her sister, and the sister had accidentally revealed she was alive. I wouldn't make that mistake. I opened my laptop and began researching private investigators in Alaska. I needed someone who could document Catherine's behavior after my supposed death. Someone who could gather evidence of her celebrating, spending the insurance money, maybe even bragging about how clever she'd been. By midnight, I had a plan. By the end of the week, Catherine Morrison Blake would learn that her mother was far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter had given me the perfect gift after all, the gift of knowing exactly who she really was. 3 days before my departure, Catherine insisted on helping me pack. She arrived at my house with shopping bags full of essentials for Alaska: thermal underwear, wool socks, hand warmers, and a beautiful new parka that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "We want you to be comfortable," she said, carefully folding each item into my suitcase. "Alaska can be dangerous if you're not properly prepared." I watched her gentle ministrations with fascination. She was packing my funeral clothes with the same care she'd once used to pack my birthday presents. The woman could have won Academy Awards. "This trip means so much to me," I told her honestly. It did mean something, just not what she thought. "I know it does, Mom. That's why we wanted to make it perfect." Perfect. That was one word for it. The next morning, I made 2 crucial phone calls. The first was to a private investigator in Anchorage named Sarah Coleman. I'd found her through an online search for investigators specializing in insurance fraud. Her credentials were impressive, and her rates were reasonable. "Mrs. Morrison, what you're asking for is highly unusual," Sarah said, after I'd explained what I needed. "I understand that. But can you do it? Document someone's behavior after they believe a family member has died?" "Yes, I can do that. But I have to ask, why not just report your suspicions to the police? Because suspicions aren't proof. I need evidence that will hold up in court. This could take weeks or even months to gather sufficient evidence." "I have time," I said. "I have nothing but time." The second call was to Thomas Mackenzie directly. I'd gotten his number from the trip paperwork Catherine had provided. "Mr. Mackenzie? This is Eleanor Morrison. I believe my daughter has spoken with you about my upcoming trip." "Oh yes, Mrs. Morrison. I'm looking forward to showing you the Northern Lights. Catherine mentioned you're particularly interested in photography." I could hear the nervousness in his voice. Good. That meant he knew exactly what Catherine had really hired him to do. "Actually, Mr. Mackenzie, I was hoping we could meet privately before the trip. Perhaps you could come to Boston. I'd be happy to cover your travel expenses." There was a long pause. "I'm not sure that's necessary, ma'am." "I think it is. You see, I'm aware of your financial situation. The gambling debts, specifically." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do. $47,000 to some very unpleasant people in Las Vegas. My daughter is using that information to blackmail you into helping her murder me." The silence stretched so long, I thought he might have hung up. "Mrs. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding at all. The question is whether you'd prefer to work with a woman who's blackmailing you or with one who's willing to pay you $50,000 to help her disappear instead of die." That got his attention. "You're serious?" "Completely. I'll pay off your debts plus an extra $3,000 for your trouble. All I need is your help staging my death convincingly enough to fool the authorities and my daughter." "Why would you want to fake your own death?" "Because sometimes, Mr. Mackenzie, the only way to catch a murderer is to give them exactly what they want." We arranged to meet the next day at a hotel near Logan Airport. I chose a public place where we could talk privately, without arousing Catherine's suspicions if she happened to be watching my movements. Thomas Mackenzie turned out to be a lean, weathered man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and the careful movements of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. We sat in the hotel restaurant, ostensibly 2 travelers discussing a tour itinerary. "Your daughter showed me pictures of you," he said quietly. "She seemed very concerned about your safety in the wilderness." "I'm sure she was." "What exactly did she ask you to do?" He looked uncomfortable. She said you'd probably try to wander off during the tours. She was worried you might get lost, maybe even hurt yourself. She asked me to make sure nothing happened to you. By making sure something did happen to me. Thomas nodded reluctantly. The plan was to stage a fall during one of the night viewings. Remote location, no witnesses, completely plausible accident. Your body wouldn't be found until spring thaw. The casual way he described my planned murder should have terrified me. Instead, I felt oddly proud of Catherine's thoroughness. She really had thought of everything. Here's what I'm proposing instead, I said, sliding a cashier's check across the table. $50,000 as promised. You help me disappear instead of die. We stage the fall exactly as planned. But instead of leaving my body, you help me get to a safe location where I can establish a new identity. Thomas stared at the check. This is real? As real as your gambling debts. The question is whether you want to be an accessory to murder or an accessory to escape. What about your daughter? She'll expect confirmation that the job is done. You'll give her exactly what she expects. Tell her the fall was convincing. The body was swept away by the current. It'll never be found. She won't question details as long as she believes I'm dead. Thomas was quiet for a long time, studying the check and probably calculating whether $50,000 was worth the risk of crossing my daughter. Mrs. Morrison, can I ask you something? Of course. Why not just disappear without the staging? Why fake your death at all? I smiled. Because, Mr. Mackenzie, I want to watch my daughter celebrate. I want to document her relief, her eagerness to claim the insurance money, maybe even her confession to someone she trusts. I want enough evidence to destroy her life the same way she tried to destroy mine. And after you have that evidence, then Eleanor Morrison will rise from the dead to attend her own funeral. And Catherine Blake will learn that there are worse things than having a dead mother. Thomas folded the check and put it in his pocket. Mrs. Morrison, I think your daughter picked the wrong woman to underestimate. Yes, I agreed. She certainly did. The flight to Fairbanks was smooth, but I spent most of it composing what might be my final letter to Catherine. Not because I expected to die, but because I needed her to find something that would explain my apparent mental state before the accident. I wrote about feeling depressed since Robert's death, about how lonely the house felt, about how I sometimes wondered if life was worth living. It was heartbreaking to write because some of it was actually true. I had been struggling. I had been lonely, but I'd also been healing, slowly finding my way back to purpose and meaning. Catherine would read this letter and feel justified in what she'd done. She'd tell people I'd been suicidal, that the Alaska trip was meant to help, but I'd been too far gone to save. It would make my death seem even more tragic and inevitable. The hotel in Fairbanks was nicer than I'd expected. Catherine really had spared no expense for my final vacation. Thomas Mackenzie met me in the lobby at 6 p.m., exactly as planned. Mrs. Morrison, welcome to Alaska. His public persona was completely different from the nervous man I'd met in Boston. This was the experienced guide, confident and reassuring. Are you excited to see the Northern Lights? I've been dreaming of this trip for years, I said truthfully. We had dinner together, discussing the itinerary, while other tourists chatted around us. Tomorrow we'd visit the local sites, take some daytime photos, get me acclimated to the cold. The accident was scheduled for the second night, during a private viewing session at a remote location. The weather forecast looks perfect, Thomas said. Clear skies, minimal light pollution. If the aurora cooperates, you'll see something magical. After dinner, I called Catherine from my hotel room. Mom, how was the flight? Is everything beautiful? It's incredible, sweetheart. Thomas seems lovely, and the hotel is wonderful. I can't thank you enough for this gift. You deserve it, Mom. I'm so glad you're finally getting to live a little. Live a little. The phrase hung in the air after we disconnected. That's exactly what I intended to do. The next day passed in a blur of tourist activities. We visited a dog mushing demonstration, toured the University of Alaska Museum, and took a scenic drive through the wilderness. Thomas was the perfect guide, knowledgeable, entertaining, and attentive to my needs as an older traveler. But I could see him watching me too, probably wondering if I was having second thoughts about our arrangement. The money was already in his account. I'd transferred it that morning. But I could tell he was still processing the surreal nature of our situation. That evening, as we prepared for the night viewing, I left the letter for Catherine on my hotel desk, where housekeeping would find it after I disappeared. I also left detailed instructions about my funeral arrangements and a will that left everything to my grandchildren in trust. Catherine would be furious when she discovered I'd changed my will without telling her. But that fury would be useful evidence later. "Ready for the show of a lifetime?" Thomas asked as we climbed into his truck. "More ready than you can imagine." The location he'd chosen was perfect for our purposes. A frozen lake surrounded by wilderness, accessible only by a narrow trail. If someone really did fall through the ice here, their body might not be recovered for months. We waited in his heated truck for 2 hours before the lights appeared. When they did, they were everything I'd hoped for and more. Sheets of green and purple fire danced across the star-filled sky, reflecting off the snow and ice in ways that seemed almost supernatural. "It's magnificent," I whispered. "It really is," Thomas agreed. "Makes you understand why people risk everything to see this." At 11:47 p.m., we put our plan into action. I climbed out of the truck with my camera, pretending to search for the perfect angle. Thomas followed, carrying additional equipment. To any observer, we would have looked like guide and client engaged in normal aurora photography. "The ice looks solid here," I called out, moving toward the lake's edge. "Be careful, Mrs. Morrison. These edges can be deceptive." What happened next was choreographed with theatrical precision. I pretended to slip on the icy ground, windmilling my arms dramatically before falling toward the lake. Thomas lunged forward as if trying to catch me, shouting my name with convincing panic. But instead of hitting the water, I rolled behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders where Thomas had previously hidden a survival pack, complete with warm clothes, emergency beacon, and coordinates for our real destination. For the next hour, Thomas played his part perfectly. He called for help on his radio, reporting a terrible accident. He threw my parka and gloves into the water to create evidence of my fall. He even managed to sound genuinely distressed when he described the incident to the emergency responders. While he handled the official response, I changed into warmer clothes and activated a GPS device that would lead me to a hunting cabin Thomas had arranged, 6 miles deeper into the wilderness. The cabin was stocked with supplies for 2 weeks. I had satellite internet, a secure phone, and everything I needed to monitor the aftermath of my death from safety. By dawn, Eleanor Morrison was officially missing and presumed dead in the Alaskan wilderness. And in Boston, my loving daughter was about to receive the phone call she'd been waiting for. Catherine's reaction to news of my death was even more perfect than I'd hoped. Sarah Coleman, the private investigator I'd hired, called me at the cabin 12 hours after Thomas reported the accident. "Your daughter received the call at 6:23 a.m. Eastern Time," Sarah reported. "I was positioned across the street from her house when the call came in. I recorded her initial reaction through the window." "What did you see?" She answered the phone in her pajamas, listened for about 30 seconds, then hung up and immediately called her husband. Marcus came downstairs, and they had what appeared to be an intense but quiet conversation. Then she did something very interesting. "What?" She smiled. Not a grief-stricken smile or a relieved smile, a satisfied smile, like someone who'd just received confirmation that a business deal had gone through successfully. I felt sick. Even though I'd expected this reaction, seeing it confirmed was devastating. My daughter was genuinely happy about my death. Did she call anyone else? Several people. Her lawyer. Someone who might have been an insurance agent, and interestingly, a real estate agent. She made that last call from her car while driving to work. I couldn't hear the conversation, but she was animated and gesturing, not the behavior of someone in early grief. Over the next 3 days, Sarah provided regular updates that painted an increasingly damning picture of Catherine's response to my death. She'd called the insurance company within hours, asking about expediting the claim process. She'd contacted a real estate agent about listing my house, claiming she needed to settle the estate quickly. Most damning of all, she'd made dinner reservations for 4 at Boston's most expensive restaurant, a celebration dinner with Marcus and the children. "She told the kids about your death yesterday," Sarah reported on day 3. "I watched Sophie break down crying on the front steps. Ryan locked himself in his room and wouldn't come out for dinner. But Catherine, she spent the evening on the phone making arrangements, and I heard her laugh twice during those conversations. The children's genuine grief contrasted sharply with their mother's behavior. Sophie had posted a heartbroken tribute to me on social media. Ryan had asked his school counselor for time off. They were devastated, while their mother was planning her financial windfall. But the most incriminating evidence came on day 4, when Catherine met with her lawyer to discuss the estate. I positioned myself in the coffee shop next to his office, Sarah explained. They sat by the window, and with a directional microphone, I was able to record most of their conversation. What did she say? She asked about challenging the will. Apparently, you left everything to the grandchildren in trust, with Catherine as trustee, but limited access to the funds. She was furious about that limitation and wanted to know if she could break the trust. What did the lawyer tell her? That it would be difficult and expensive, but potentially possible if she could demonstrate that you weren't mentally competent when you updated the will. She asked specifically about using your letter as evidence of mental instability. My letter, the one where I'd written about feeling depressed and questioning whether life was worth living. Catherine was planning to use my own words to steal from her children. But here's the interesting part, Sarah continued. She also mentioned something about a guide in Alaska who could confirm her mental state if necessary. She said she'd paid him well to pay attention to the details. Thomas Mackenzie. She was planning to use him as a witness to my supposed mental decline, not knowing that he was actually working for me now. There's more, Sarah said. After the meeting, she called someone and said, Phase 1 is complete. The old bat finally did something useful. Then she laughed and said something about Alaska being perfect for solving problems. I had to put down the phone for a moment. Hearing my daughter refer to me as the old bat hurt more than I'd expected, but it also strengthened my resolve. Sarah, I need you to keep documenting everything, every phone call, every meeting, every conversation, and I need you to get me copies of any financial transactions she makes in the next few weeks. What are you planning, Mrs. Morrison? I'm planning to attend my own funeral, and then I'm going to rise from the dead to destroy the woman who killed me. That evening, I called James Patterson from my satellite phone. Eleanor? Thank God. How are you holding up? I'm fine, James. Better than fine, actually. How's the official investigation going? They've called off the search. The assumption is that your body was swept into deeper water and won't be recovered until spring. Catherine has been surprisingly composed during the interviews. I'll bet she has. James, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to schedule a reading of my will for next week. Tell Catherine it's standard procedure, but make sure you record the entire session. I want to see her reaction when she learns the full terms of the trust. Eleanor, are you sure about this timeline? Once we start formal legal proceedings? I'm sure. It's time to set the trap. The next morning, I received news that made everything worth it. Sarah called with an update that confirmed everything I'd suspected about my daughter's character. She's planning a memorial service for this weekend, Sarah reported. But here's the strange part. She didn't invite your neighbors or your friends from the community center. It's family only, plus some people I don't recognize. Business associates, maybe. What kind of memorial service excludes the deceased's friends? The kind where the focus isn't on mourning. I managed to get the guest list through a contact at the catering company. It's very small, very exclusive, and the menu is expensive. More like a private celebration than a funeral. I thought about my friends at the community center, the women I played bridge with every Tuesday, the neighbors who checked on me during snowstorms. Catherine had deliberately excluded anyone who actually cared about me. Sarah, I need you to be my eyes and ears at that memorial service. I want to know exactly what she says about me, how she acts, who she talks to. I'll be there. But Mrs. Morrison, are you prepared for what you might hear? I looked out the cabin window at the vast Alaskan wilderness, thinking about the daughter I'd raised and the woman she'd become. I've been preparing for this my whole life, I said. I just didn't know it until now. The memorial service was exactly what I'd expected, and worse. Sarah's recording equipment captured every damning moment, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Mom was never the same after Dad died, Catherine told the small gathering. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that people were trying to take advantage of her financially. She'd changed her will multiple times in the last year, never satisfied with any arrangement. Lies. Complete fabrication designed to lay groundwork for challenging my mental competency. The Alaska trip was actually my attempt to help her reconnect with life, she continued, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. She'd talked about suicide several times, and I thought maybe seeing something beautiful would remind her that life was worth living. More lies. I'd never mentioned suicide to Catherine, never expressed anything but normal grief over losing Robert. But the most horrifying moment came when Marcus stood to speak. Eleanor was a complicated woman in her final years, he said. The financial decisions she made toward the end weren't always rational. We tried to intervene, tried to help her see reason, but she was very stubborn about maintaining control. Sarah's microphone caught Catherine nodding emphatically, adding, "She actually accused me of wanting her dead. Can you imagine? I was trying to help her, and she thought I was plotting against her." The irony was breathtaking. She was describing exactly what she'd been doing while presenting it as evidence of my mental decline. The funeral ended with Catherine announcing that she would be challenging my will to protect the children's interests and ensure that my irrational final decisions didn't harm the family financially. 20 people attended my memorial service. 20 people who listened to my daughter systematically destroy my reputation to justify stealing from my grandchildren. That evening, I called Thomas Mackenzie for an update on his end of the charade. "The authorities are satisfied with my report," he said. "I told them you'd seemed disoriented during the tour, complained about feeling dizzy, mentioned that life didn't hold much meaning anymore. They've classified it as an accidental death with possible suicidal ideation." "Perfect. And Catherine?" "She called me yesterday. Wanted to confirm details about your mental state. Just like you predicted. She's paying me an additional $5,000 to be available as a witness if needed." "Did you take the money?" "Of course. But I also recorded the conversation. She was very explicit about what she wanted me to say in court. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan." Catherine was building her case against my competency, unaware that every lie she told was being documented. But the hardest part was still ahead, watching my grandchildren grieve while their mother celebrated. Sarah sent me video footage of Sophie crying in her bedroom, looking at old photos of us together. She sent pictures of Ryan wearing the sweater I'd knitted him for Christmas, sitting alone in the backyard where we used to plant vegetables together. They were genuinely devastated by my death, while the person who should have been comforting them was busy with lawyers and financial planners. On day 7 of my official death, Catherine made the mistake I'd been waiting for. She called her sister, Sarah reported, Lisa, who lives in California. I couldn't get close enough to hear the full conversation, but I caught fragments. Catherine said something about the old woman finally being out of the way and Alaska solving all our problems. She also mentioned that the insurance money would set us up for life. Lisa Morrison Chen, Robert's younger sister, who'd always disliked Catherine and had limited contact with the family. If Catherine was confiding in Lisa, she must have felt very secure about her success. Did Lisa seem receptive to what Catherine was saying? Hard to tell, but after they hung up, Catherine looked very pleased with herself. She made another call immediately after, to a travel agent. Apparently she's booking a cruise to celebrate once the estate is settled. A cruise. While her children were still mourning their grandmother, Catherine was planning a victory vacation. But that wasn't even the worst part. "There's something else," Sarah said. "I followed Catherine to a storage unit yesterday. She was cleaning out boxes of your belongings, things she'd apparently taken from your house before anyone else could go through them." "What kind of things?" "Photo albums, jewelry, some documents. But instead of keeping them for the children, she was throwing most of it in a dumpster. I managed to rescue some items after she left, including what looks like your wedding album and a jewelry box." My wedding album. The jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. Catherine was literally throwing away family history, erasing evidence of my life and relationships. "Sarah, I need you to document everything she discarded. Photos, videos, a complete inventory. And I need copies of all the recordings you've made. Already done. Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, when are you planning to reveal that you're alive?" I'd been asking myself the same question. Every day I delayed meant more pain for Sophie and Ryan, more time for Catherine to consolidate her position. But I needed overwhelming evidence, something so damning that no court would ever question Catherine's true nature. "Soon," I said. "Very soon." The answer came the next day, when Sarah called with news that changed everything. Catherine just met with a man I've been unable to identify, she said. They met in a parking garage, very secretive. I couldn't get close enough to hear the conversation, but I saw money change hands. A lot of money. What kind of man? Rough-looking. Not someone from her usual social circle. And Mrs. Morrison, after he left, Catherine made a phone call where she mentioned taking care of loose ends and making sure Alaska stays in Alaska. Thomas Mackenzie. Catherine was planning to eliminate the one witness who could connect her to my murder. I called Thomas immediately. Thomas, you need to disappear, right now. Catherine's planning to have you killed. What? Are you serious? Dead serious. She can't risk you changing your story or demanding more money. You're a liability now. There was silence on the line. Mr. Mackenzie, are you there? I'm here. I knew she was cold, but I didn't think she'd go this far. Well, now you know. The question is, are you ready to help me bring her down? What do you need me to do? I need you to disappear for a few days, then resurface very publicly at the police station in Boston. Tell them you lied about my mental state because Catherine paid you to, and that you have evidence she planned my murder. She'll deny everything. Of course she will. But by then, I'll be back from the dead to confirm your story. It was time for Eleanor Morrison to return to the land of the living. And Catherine Blake was about to learn that killing your mother is much easier than staying dead. The plan for my resurrection required perfect timing and maximum shock value. I wanted Catherine to feel secure in her success right up until the moment her world exploded. James Patterson helped coordinate everything from Boston while I prepared for my dramatic reappearance. The first step was getting Thomas Mackenzie safely to the authorities. I've contacted Detective Rodriguez at Boston PD, James reported during our morning call. He's agreed to meet with Thomas privately and review all the evidence we've compiled. What did you tell him? That we have evidence of a conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and attempted murder. I didn't mention that you're alive. I thought that revelation should come from you personally. Thomas had already left Alaska, flying directly to Boston with a full confession and all the recordings he'd made of his conversations with Catherine. He was scared, but his fear was working in our favor. A frightened witness is often the most convincing witness. Meanwhile, Sarah continued documenting Catherine's behavior, which was becoming increasingly reckless. She's spending money like it's already in her account, Sarah reported. New car, expensive jewelry, designer clothes. She told the salesperson at Nordstrom that she'd recently come into an inheritance she hasn't legally received yet. Exactly. She also mentioned to the jewelry store clerk that the previous owner wouldn't be needing it anymore, quote unquote. Catherine's arrogance was becoming her weakness. She was so confident that she'd committed the perfect crime that she wasn't bothering to maintain her grieving daughter persona except in public. But the final straw came when Sarah reported on Catherine's interaction with my grandchildren. Sophie asked her mother if she could have your pearl necklace as a remembrance, Sarah said. Catherine told her the pearls weren't real and had been thrown away. But Mrs. Morrison, I watched Catherine wear those same pearls to dinner last night. My grandmother's pearls. The ones I'd promised Sophie for her 18th birthday. Catherine was not only stealing them, but lying to her daughter about their fate. That's it, I said. I'm coming home. The logistics of returning from the dead were more complicated than I'd anticipated. I couldn't simply show up at the airport as Eleanor Morrison. Officially, I was dead, and my identification would raise immediate questions. But James had anticipated this problem. Through his legal connections, he'd arranged for a private investigator's license under an assumed name, complete with documentation that would allow me to travel without triggering electronic alerts. You'll be traveling as Margaret Henley, insurance investigator, he explained. If anyone asks, you're looking into a potential fraud case in Alaska. The flight from Fairbanks to Boston was surreal. I was returning to a world where I was supposed to be dead, carrying evidence that would destroy my only child. But I felt more alive than I had in months. I landed at Logan Airport on a Tuesday morning and went straight to James's office, where Thomas Mackenzie was waiting with Detective Rodriguez and a court stenographer. Mrs. Morrison, Detective Rodriguez said, his expression carefully neutral. I have to say, this is the most unusual case I've encountered in 20 years of police work. I imagine so, Detective, but unusual doesn't make it less criminal. We spent 4 hours going through every piece of evidence. The recordings of Catherine discussing my murder, the documentation of her behavior after my supposed death, the financial records showing her premature spending, and Thomas's confession about the staged accident. "This is enough for multiple charges," Rodriguez said finally. "Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, witness tampering. But Mrs. Morrison, you understand that your own actions could be problematic? Faking your death, even to catch a criminal, isn't strictly legal." "I understand. But detective, would you rather prosecute a woman who faked her death to catch her would-be murderer, or let an actual murderer walk free because her victim didn't die on schedule?" He smiled grimly. "Point taken. What do you want to do about the arrest?" "I want to be there when you take her into custody. I want to see her face when she realizes she's been caught." "That's highly irregular. Detective, my daughter tried to have me killed. I think I've earned the right to be irregular." He agreed to let me observe the arrest from a distance, though I suspect James's legal reputation influenced that decision more than my emotional appeal. That evening, I checked into a hotel under my assumed name and called Sarah Coleman for a final update on Catherine's activities. "She's having dinner with Marcus at Bistro du Midi," Sarah reported. "They're celebrating something. I heard her tell the waiter it was an early anniversary dinner, but their anniversary isn't until October." "What else?" "She's been making inquiries about private schools for the children. Expensive ones. Sophie has no idea. She thinks she's going to finish high school at her current school. Catherine was already reorganizing her children's lives around money she'd stolen from them. The depth of her betrayal was staggering. Sarah, after tomorrow, your job will be done. I can't thank you enough for everything you've documented. Mrs. Morrison, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How does it feel, knowing what you know about your daughter?" I considered the question. How did it feel to discover that the child you'd raised, loved unconditionally, and sacrificed for, was capable of murder? "It feels like grieving someone who's still alive," I said finally. "The Catherine I thought I knew never existed. I've been mourning a fiction." The next morning, Detective Rodriguez called with the arrest plan. "We're taking her into custody at 11 a.m. when she leaves her yoga class. Public place? Witnesses? Minimal chance for violence or escape. I'll be watching from the coffee shop across the street. Mrs. Morrison, are you prepared for this? Seeing your daughter arrested for trying to kill you?" I thought about Sophie crying in her bedroom, about Ryan sitting alone in our garden, about my pearls around Catherine's throat. "Detective, I've been prepared for this moment since the day I heard her planning my murder. The only question is whether she's prepared for it." At 10:45 a.m., I took my position in the coffee shop with a clear view of the yoga studio. Sarah Coleman joined me, carrying a camera with a telephoto lens to document Catherine's arrest for the record. At 11:03 a.m., Catherine walked out of the yoga studio, checking her phone and smiling about something she'd read. She looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware that her world was about to end. At 11:04 a.m., Detective Rodriguez approached her with 2 uniformed officers. At 11:05 a.m., Catherine Blake learned that her mother was much harder to kill than she'd imagined. The look on Catherine's face when Detective Rodriguez showed her his badge was everything I'd hoped for and dreaded simultaneously. For just a moment, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I wanted to protect her from what was coming. Then I remembered Thomas Mackenzie's description of how she'd planned to stage my death, and the sympathy evaporated. "Catherine Morrison Blake, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and witness tampering," Rodriguez announced in a voice that carried across the street. Catherine's yoga mat fell from her hands as she stared at him in shock. "There must be some mistake. I haven't done anything wrong. Ma'am, we have recorded conversations and witness testimony regarding your plan to murder your mother in Alaska." "My mother is dead. She died in an accident. How can I be charged with murdering someone who's already dead?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "That's where things get interesting. Your mother isn't as dead as you thought." The confusion on Catherine's face was almost comical. She looked around as if expecting hidden cameras, some elaborate prank that would explain the impossible situation. "That's not possible. Thomas Mackenzie called me. He confirmed she fell through the ice. They never found her body because it was swept away. Thomas Mackenzie is cooperating with our investigation," Rodriguez explained as he cuffed her hands behind her back. "He's told us everything about your arrangement, including the recordings you don't know he made." I watched my daughter's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, calculating assessment as she tried to process this turn of events. "I want my lawyer," she said finally. "Of course. You'll have plenty of time to call him from the station." As they led her away, Catherine twisted around, scanning the street as if she might somehow spot me watching. For a moment, our eyes almost met across the distance, but she was looking for a ghost, not the very alive woman sipping coffee in the shop window. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked quietly. "Like I just buried my daughter," I said. Again. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving me time to prepare for what would be the most difficult thing I'd ever done, testifying against my own child. James handled the media carefully, releasing just enough information to explain my survival without sensationalizing the story. The headlines were still dramatic: "Daughter accused of mother's murder, but mom's not dead," and "Alaska murder plot unravels when victim survives." The hardest part was dealing with Sophie and Ryan. They'd been told their grandmother was dead, grieved for a week, and now had to process not only that I was alive, but that their mother had tried to kill me. I met them at James's office, neutral territory where we could talk privately with a counselor present. "Grandma?" Sophie's voice was barely a whisper when she saw me. "Are you real?" "I'm real, sweetheart. I'm so sorry you had to go through thinking I was dead." She launched herself into my arms, sobbing with a mixture of relief and confusion. Ryan held back, his 13-year-old mind struggling to make sense of the situation. "Mom said you fell in Alaska," he said finally. "She showed us pictures of the lake where you died." "I did fall in that lake, Ryan, but I didn't die. Your mother paid someone to make it look like an accident, but I figured out what she was planning and arranged to survive instead." "So Mom tried to kill you?" Sophie asked, pulling back to look at me. "Yes, sweetheart, she did." "Why?" The question every child asks when their world stops making sense. Why did this happen? Why would someone we love hurt us? Why isn't the world safe and predictable like we thought? "I think your mother has some serious problems with money and making good decisions," I said carefully. "She convinced herself that she needed my life insurance money more than she needed me alive." Ryan was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "What happens to us now?" It was the question I'd been dreading. Marcus would likely be charged as an accessory, meaning both parents could face prison time. The children would need somewhere to live, someone to care for them. "You'll live with me," I said, "if that's what you want. Your house, your schools, your friends, everything can stay the same. The only thing that changes is that I'll be taking care of you instead of your parents." "What about Mom?" Sophie asked. "Will she go to jail?" "That depends on what a judge and jury decide. But Sophie, honey, even if she doesn't go to jail, she can't take care of you right now. She needs help with her problems, and that might take a long time." The next week passed in a blur of legal meetings, psychiatric evaluations, and media interviews. Catherine's lawyer tried to argue that she'd suffered a mental breakdown following her father's death, that the murder plot was the result of temporary insanity brought on by grief and financial stress. But the recordings Thomas had made painted a different picture. Catherine hadn't sounded insane or grief-stricken when she'd discussed my death. She'd sounded calculating and pleased with her cleverness. The insurance company immediately froze any claims and began their own investigation. The real estate agent who'd helped Catherine list my house received a cease and desist order. Every financial move Catherine had made, based on my supposed death, was being reversed. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. "Detective Rodriguez called this morning," James told me. "Catherine's sister Lisa has come forward. Apparently, Catherine called her several times over the past months, discussing her financial problems and mentioning that she wished you would die so she could inherit." Lisa Morrison Chen, the sister-in-law who'd never liked Catherine but had stayed neutral for family peace. Apparently, Catherine's post-death phone call about solving problems had finally convinced Lisa to speak up. What exactly did Lisa tell them? That Catherine had specifically mentioned Alaska as a perfect place for accidents, and had asked Lisa hypothetical questions about life insurance payouts and how long probate takes for accidental deaths. Catherine had been planning this for months, possibly even before she'd given me the trip. The gift that had seemed so generous was actually a carefully laid trap. The preliminary hearing was a media circus. I testified for 2 hours, describing the phone call I'd overheard, my decision to fake my death, and Catherine's behavior afterward. The recordings were played for the judge, including Catherine's celebration dinner reservations and her conversation with Thomas about ensuring my mental instability was well documented. Catherine sat at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the confident woman who'd planned my murder. She'd lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and she kept glancing around the courtroom as if expecting someone to rescue her from this nightmare. When our eyes met, I saw something I'd never seen before in my daughter's face. Genuine fear. Not fear of punishment, but fear that she'd finally been seen for who she really was. The judge ordered Catherine held without bail pending trial, citing both flight risk and the severity of the charges. As she was led away in handcuffs, Catherine turned back to look at me one more time. "I'm sorry, Mom," she called out. "I never meant for things to go this far." I wanted to respond, to say something motherly and forgiving. Instead, I remained silent. Some apologies come too late to matter. 3 months later, I sat in the courtroom watching my daughter's murder trial with the strange detachment of someone observing a car accident in slow motion. Catherine looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of what she'd done. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Thomas Mackenzie testified for 6 hours about Catherine's recruitment of him, the detailed planning sessions, and her explicit instructions about making my death look accidental. The recordings were played again, including the damning conversation where Catherine discussed the insurance money solving all their problems. But the most devastating testimony came from Marcus Blake. Catherine's husband had been offered a plea deal in exchange for his cooperation. Facing his own potential prison time, Marcus revealed details about their marriage that painted Catherine in an even darker light. Catherine had been talking about her mother's death as an inevitability for over a year, Marcus testified. She'd made comments about how Eleanor was getting older, how she couldn't live forever, how much easier things would be when she was gone. "Did your wife ever specifically mention hastening that inevitability?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes. About 6 months ago, she suggested that we should encourage Eleanor to travel more, maybe visit some dangerous places. She specifically mentioned Alaska as somewhere accidents could happen naturally." I watched Catherine's face as her husband destroyed her defense. She looked betrayed, as if Marcus's honesty was somehow worse than her own crimes. But the prosecution wasn't done. "Mr. Blake, can you tell the court about the life insurance policies your wife took out on her mother?" My blood ran cold. Life insurance policies, plural? Catherine took out 3 separate policies on Eleanor's life over the past 2 years, Marcus continued. She forged Eleanor's signature on the applications and paid the premiums from our joint account. What was the total death benefit from these policies? $8.5 million. The courtroom erupted in gasps. I felt the air leave my lungs. $8.5 million. Catherine hadn't just been planning to kill me for my existing life insurance. She'd been systematically increasing the payout for months. "Were you aware your wife was forging your mother-in-law's signature?" I knew she was handling Eleanor's insurance matters, but I didn't ask for details. Catherine said Eleanor had requested help with her financial planning. Another lie. Catherine had never discussed insurance with me, never asked to help with financial planning. She'd been secretly turning my life into a lottery ticket. The defense attorney tried to salvage the case by portraying Catherine as a woman driven to desperate acts by financial pressure and her father's recent death. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about grief-induced temporary insanity and stressed that Catherine had ultimately not succeeded in killing anyone. But the fraud charges alone were enough to destroy their argument. You don't forge multiple insurance policies during a temporary mental break. You don't recruit accomplices and plan elaborate murder scenarios while insane. Catherine's actions showed clear premeditation and rational planning. The most heartbreaking moment came when Sophie took the stand as a character witness for her mother. At 16, she was old enough to testify, but young enough to still believe in the inherent goodness of parents. She described Catherine as a loving mother who'd been overwhelmed by circumstances, who'd made a terrible mistake, but didn't deserve to lose everything. "My mom isn't a murderer," Sophie said through tears. "She's just scared and confused. She needs help, not prison." I wanted to comfort my granddaughter, to explain that some people we love are capable of things we never imagined. But she would have to learn that painful truth on her own. Catherine chose not to testify in her own defense, probably on advice from her lawyer. There was too much evidence against her, too many recorded conversations that would be impossible to explain away. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood to read the verdict with the solemnity of someone announcing a death. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of insurance fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty. Catherine collapsed in her chair as the verdicts continued. Marcus, watching from the gallery, put his head in his hands. Sophie sobbed silently while Ryan stared straight ahead with the blank expression of someone whose world has just shattered completely. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, warning that Catherine faced potentially 25 years to life, depending on how the charges were combined. As the courtroom emptied, I found myself alone with James Patterson, watching the bailiffs prepare to escort Catherine back to jail. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "how are you holding up?" I thought about the question. My daughter was going to prison for trying to murder me. My grandchildren were orphans in everything but name. My family was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. "I'm alive," I said finally. 6 months ago, Catherine was planning to make sure I wasn't. Everything else is just details. But as Catherine was led away, she turned back one more time. This time, instead of fear or anger, I saw something that looked almost like relief in her eyes. Maybe being caught was easier than living with what she'd done. Or maybe she was just relieved that she no longer had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Either way, our relationship was over. The daughter I'd raised and loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't forgive. The only question now was whether the woman who'd survived Catherine's murder plot could figure out how to live with the aftermath. 1 year later, I stood in the same Alaskan wilderness where I was supposed to have died, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in sheets of green and gold fire. But this time, I wasn't alone. Sophie and Ryan flanked me, bundled in parkas and warm boots, their faces turned upward in wonder at nature's most spectacular light show. "It's incredible, Grandma," Sophie whispered. "I can see why you wanted to come here." The past year had been the hardest of our lives, but also, in unexpected ways, the most healing. Catherine had been sentenced to 18 years in prison after pleading guilty to a reduced set of charges. Marcus received 5 years for his cooperation in the fraud scheme. Both children were now officially in my custody, and we'd slowly rebuilt our lives around honesty instead of secrets. "Tell us the story again," Ryan said, as we sat in Thomas Mackenzie's truck, warming our hands around thermoses of hot chocolate. "About how you figured out what Mom was planning." I told them the story dozens of times, but they needed to hear it repeatedly, trying to make sense of how their mother had become capable of murder. "I heard her on the phone," I said simply. "She thought I was still at the doctor's office, but I'd come home early. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones people think you can't hear." Thomas Mackenzie, who'd become an unlikely friend through our shared trauma, smiled from the driver's seat. "Your grandmother is the toughest person I've ever met. She turned a murder plot into a survival strategy." "But weren't you scared?" Sophie asked. "Terrified," I admitted, "but I was more afraid of dying without making sure you two were protected. Your mother was planning to steal your inheritance along with everything else." The legal aftermath had been complex, but ultimately satisfying. All of Catherine's fraudulent insurance policies were voided. The $8.5 million she'd expected to receive was returned to the various companies she'd defrauded. Our real estate lawyer had successfully protected my actual assets, ensuring that Sophie and Ryan's college funds remained intact. More importantly, Catherine's conviction meant she would never have access to the children or their inheritance. The courts had permanently severed her parental rights, a decision that still broke my heart but was necessary for everyone's safety. "Do you think Mom will try to contact us when she gets out?" Ryan asked. It was a question they'd asked repeatedly over the past year. Catherine would be eligible for parole in 12 years, meaning she could be released when Sophie was 28 and Ryan was 25. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Prison changes people, sometimes for the better. Maybe your mother will use that time to figure out how she became someone capable of murder. Would you forgive her? Sophie asked. If she really changed? I'd been wrestling with that question for months. Forgiveness is complicated when the person who hurt you is your own child, especially when their actions continue to hurt your grandchildren every day. Forgiveness isn't about her, I said finally. It's about us. We can't let her choices poison the rest of our lives. The lights above us intensified, turning the snow-covered landscape into something magical and otherworldly. I thought about the Eleanor Morrison who'd come here a year ago, expecting to die in this wilderness. That woman had been afraid, isolated, convinced that her usefulness to her family had ended. This Eleanor Morrison was different, stronger, more aware of her own worth, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. I have something to tell you both, I said, as we watched the aurora dance. I've been thinking about our future, about what kind of life we want to build together. Both children turned to me with the slightly worried expressions they'd developed whenever I announced major decisions. I've decided to sell the house in Boston, I continued. It has too many complicated memories for all of us. Instead, I want us to choose a place together, somewhere that belongs to just us. Where would we go? Ryan asked. Wherever you want. We have options now. I could keep working. I'm thinking about writing a book about our experience. Or we could travel for a while, see the country, figure out what calls to us. Sophie and Ryan exchanged glances, having one of those wordless conversations that siblings master. Could we stay in Alaska for a while? Sophie asked finally. I know it sounds weird, but this place feels like where our real story started. I looked around at the vast wilderness that had been intended as my graveyard, but had instead become the place where I'd learned to fight back. I think that's a perfect idea. 3 months later, we were living in a small but comfortable house in Fairbanks, Alaska. I'd found work teaching literature at the local community college. Sophie had enrolled in high school and made friends with remarkable resilience. Ryan had discovered a love of wilderness photography and spent weekends with Thomas Mackenzie learning to navigate the backcountry safely. We were building a life based on truth instead of manipulation, love instead of obligation. I often thought about Catherine in her prison cell, wondering if she understood what she'd lost. Not just her freedom, but her children's trust, her mother's love, and any hope of the family she'd claimed to be protecting. The book I'd started writing was part memoir, part warning about how financial desperation can corrupt even the deepest family bonds. I called it Surviving Your Own Murder, a mother's story of betrayal and justice. But the real story wasn't about Catherine's crimes or my survival. It was about Sophie and Ryan, who'd managed to maintain their capacity for love and trust, despite learning that one of their parents had tried to murder the other. They were the true heroes of this story. On quiet evenings, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible colors and my grandchildren did homework at the kitchen table, I sometimes thought about the different ways people respond to loss. Catherine had responded to financial loss by planning murder. I'd responded to potential loss of life by fighting back. Sophie and Ryan had responded to the loss of their parents by choosing to build something new with the family they had left. Love, it turned out, was more resilient than fear. Truth was more powerful than manipulation. And sometimes, being underestimated by someone who wants to destroy you is the greatest advantage you can have. My daughter had given me the perfect gift after all. She'd shown me exactly how strong I was when everything was taken away. She'd taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about choosing to live fully despite the people who want to see you dead. And every time I watched the northern lights dance across the Alaskan sky, I remembered that some of the most beautiful things in life are only visible in the darkness. Catherine had tried to bury me in that darkness. Instead, I'd learned to make it beautiful. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.